My name is Professor Deborah Johnston, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm Pro Vice-Chancellor Academic Framework here at London South Bank University. So it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural lecture for Professor Nicki Martin. The presentation of an inaugural lecture is a major milestone in the career of a full professor. And the inaugural lecture gives that person the opportunity to share their research interests with people and also to talk about future plans. It's a major milestone for the departments in which inaugural professors are based, because it gives people a chance to celebrate and to also revive old friendships, all those alumni or former staff members who come back, but also to create new connections. And for us in the university generally, an inaugural lecture is a vital moment to share with the general public the value and the impact of our research and teaching. So as such, we have been delighted to restart our inaugural lecture series after the pandemic. And for those of you who want to watch previous inaugural lectures, we have an inaugural lecture playlist on YouTube. Meeting in person gives an event like this, which is a major milestone, the gravity that it deserves to meet in this place, in this way. It also is a chance for us to convene afterwards for a reception. While there'll be no questions after the inaugural lecture itself, because that is the tradition, I believe Nicki would welcome questions in the reception, so please find her afterwards. Meeting in person, unfortunately, also means that I have to give you the age-old introduction to a face-to-face meeting. So, please ensure your mobile phones are switched off. We are recording this event. Toilets are signposted just outside the doors. And we have no plans for a fire alarm this evening. So if the alarm does sound, please make your way in an orderly fashion to the closest fire exit. Can I also ask that this evening we aim to clap in an autism-friendly way. So I want us all to practice our autism-friendly applause. Thank you. So, with that out of the way, let me introduce Professor Nicola Martin. Nicola started working in the field of disability in 1976 at St Margaret's Subnormality Hospital, where she was a recreation officer. She then undertook a 4-year degree in Newcastle in special education and drama, and she became a specialist school teacher in initially working with children in hospital who had profound impairments. Nicola went on to be an Inner London Education Authority special school teacher, and then obtained a scholarship to the University of Virginia for an MA, focusing on working with profoundly disabled children, and she still maintains close connections with the University of Virginia today. She completed the 2-year course in 1 year, which was just as well, because she returned to the UK, finding she was pregnant with twins. That was a surprise. Identical twin babies, Max and John, were looked after by their dad, Mike, while Nicola worked in the Department of Adolescent Psychiatry at Guy's Hospital, teaching children with dyslexia. Mike and Nicola met in London in 1983 when he returned from being a cowboy in Australia. And this was a meeting that almost didn't happen because he'd been knocked off his motorbike by a kangaroo shortly before travelling. Nicola had another baby, Anna, and worked part-time on adult literacy at Morley College before taking a job share role as head of liberal education at Lewisham College. Due to Mike's talent and hard work, the family were able to move into a practically derelict house in Lewisham, and that house was a short walk from Lewisham College. Career decisions for Nicola was very much informed by childcare. She says, "You never have that time again." The family then moved to the Peak District, and here Nicola headed provision for students with learning disabilities at High Peak College. Mike and Nikki were able to continue to share childcare, something that they've always been very glad about. Nicola went on to be head of division at the University of Derby in the School of Access and Lifelong Learning, and then headed up the Disability and Wellbeing Service and Autism Research Centre at Sheffield Hallam. In 2009, Nicola moved back to London, first to the LSE, working on the equalities agenda, and came to LSBU in 2013. The move back to London was prompted by Anna gaining a place at the Brit School. Nicola says, "It was a move that made no financial sense, but it was a very good decision," as Anna went on to be a successful theatre maker and writer. Her son Max went on to be a contortionist with a travelling circus and was featured on Britain's Got Talent. And her son John went on to study history at Queen's University Belfast and was at Balliol when they lost him. Nicola's PhD focuses on inclusive practice in higher education, and she continues to pursue these research interests which extend beyond the requirements of disabled students. She's gained various additional qualifications, specialising in working with students with dyslexia and autism, in counselling, in leadership, and in British Sign Language, which, being dyslexic, dyspraxic, and left-handed, she says she's not very good at. Nicola feels that her own experience of neurodivergence gives her a degree of empathy with people who have not had an easy route through education, and she is still amazed at having gained a grade A in A-level religious studies. Nicola has been the chair of the National Association of Disability Practitioners for 6 years. So was also the chair of the National Association of Disability Practitioners for 6 years. She's always been an active researcher, and her research has been informed by the principle, "Nothing about us without us." Her work, undertaken by the Critical Autism and Disability Studies Research Group and the Participatory Autism Research Collective, much of which Nicola co-authored with autistic scholars, was put forward as a REF case study. Nicola is currently interim lead of the Centre for Global Justice, for Social Justice and Global Responsibility, which is a role she shares with Professor Shaminda Takar. She describes this as her dream job. She is a National Teaching Fellow and a Fellow of the RSA and holds various honorary fellowships with other universities and is engaged in several international collaborations. Nicola says she loves living in London because there is so much to do. She describes herself as fortunate to have been built on strong foundations, being surrounded by supportive family, loving, long-standing friends, and amazing colleagues and friends at LSBU. Her most outstanding recent event was becoming a grandmother to baby Ferrin, who had the decency to wait to be born until International Women's Day. Finally, Professor Nicki Martin is an academic who has sought to empower those who are routinely made powerless, to amplify the voices of those who are routinely made voiceless, and who challenges us to remember what education is truly for. As such, I am privileged to work with her. So please join me in welcoming Professor Martin to deliver her inaugural address.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Thank you, I really appreciated that. And I appreciate this turnout because I understand that the trains are really messed up. So I know, for example, Mike has walked from Denmark Hill. Don't know quite why I didn't get a bus. But, you know, thank you for the effort, and I really do appreciate and I don't feel nervous about giving this presentation because I look round and I just think I'm surrounded by family, friends and valued colleagues. So it's just wonderful that you're all here. This is my agenda for this session. I'm going to just talk briefly about the influences which have informed my research work, talk about the context in which we are operating now in terms of particularly the national landscape. I'm going to look at common threads which emerge from quite a wide-ranging body of research which all coalesces around similar themes informed by the social model of disability, which I'll explain as we go along. And then I'll think about what are we doing next. And the image on this slide says nothing about us without us. As Deborah has said, this is a cornerstone of my research. And because this is about well-being and fulfilment, the title is about autism, well-being and fulfilment, but even if you knocked off the autism, well-being and fulfilment is really the theme. And the focus is on education, employment, but also health, social care, community participation and so on. And I've just got a couple of well-being images of beautiful scenery on that slide. So in terms of my inspiration, I'm a proud parent and grandparent, and there's not much more to say about that, is there really? And the person that shares exactly my feeling about the 4 people on this slide is my husband Mike, who's sitting in the audience. And if anybody wants a masterclass on dyspraxia, talk to the man I've been living with for the last 40 years. Okay, and in terms of influences, there's a set of pictures of people that I either know personally or I'm influenced by them as theorists. I haven't got time to go through all these images, unfortunately, but we will caption them for the recording so that we can explain who they are. But in the corner, we've got Mike Oliver, who is really the forefather of the social model of disability, which is all about the idea that people with impairments are disabled by structures in society, and that's a sort of underpinning theme for this research. In terms of other influences which are incredibly important, just going back to what Deborah said about my initial career, St Margaret's Subnormality Hospital, also known as an idiot colony, was the complete epitome of a segregated, institutionalized environment. And I'm not reincarnated from the Victorian times. This was in the 1970s. And it had a very, very formative effect on me. There's a picture of St Margaret's, which is a sort of green, spooky-looking castle, but I don't remember what it looked like, but it certainly had that sort of vibe. And in the middle of the slide, there's a very grainy black and white picture, and you can hardly make it out. But it's of the T4 project, and the T4 project is when Hitler practiced the mechanisms of the Holocaust on disabled people before the major event. And in critical disability studies, we are mindful to remind our students about that. Next to that, there's a little graphic for a play, All Our Children, and below that is a picture of Stephen Unwin, who's our writer-in-residence, who wrote this play about the T4 project. And we really have to remember that that happened, but we also have to remember that there are people who are segregated still. And there's a picture underneath a title that says Justice for Laughing Boy of a young man called Connor Sparrowhawk, and next to him is a picture of his mum, Sarah Ryan, who I've worked with extensively. And Connor was in an assessment and treatment centre, which is an environment where people with autism and intellectual impairments and who acquire the label of challenging behaviour, which we'll talk about in detail later, they're in for assessment and treatment. But some of them don't come out for years and years and years because community provision, which meets their needs, is not available to them. And there's just a reference there to Baroness Hollin's letter to the Secretary of State about this. So these things really impact on me and influence me, and my concern is about inclusive society, but we have to keep the background in our heads. I feel very strongly about that. So where we are now in the UK, and a lot of my research is quite UK focused, and I work in the Centre for Social Justice and Global Responsibility, and international work is one of our key priorities for next year. But I really acknowledge that this is a little bit UK focused. But we always remind our students not to say, oh, everybody's entitled to an education, because that's not the case globally. So, in the UK, currently, there's a national strategy for autistic children and young people and adults running from 21 to 26, building on the 2009 Autism Act and its subsequent iterations. It's really supposed to be under this umbrella of making society more aware of autism, more accepting of autism. And, you know, I find these terms a little bit patronising. But the priorities identified in the strategy are health, education, employment, social care, criminal justice and community. And looking around the audience, I've got colleagues here from criminology, and Professor Eddie Chaplin's over there. He's done a lot about criminal justice and autism. We're going to be aggressively seeking funding from this agenda to progress our research interests in critical autism and disability studies. I'm really concerned about the degree to which autistic involvement is going to move beyond tokenism within this agenda, because the Equality Act talks all about disabled people being involved in every decision, equality impact assessment, etc. And the extent to which that is a reality is concerning, and we don't want it to be like that with the national strategy. So my aim is to ensure that autistic people are actively employed within research within this agenda, and certainly that's what we're doing in our research centre. So here are some of our collaborators in terms of institutional collaborators, and just to step back a bit, I put loads of pictures of people who had influenced me on a previous slide. And only one person in the audience is in there, and that's Damien Milton, who's up there. And I could have put all my LSBU colleagues on that slide, but if I put some of you on and some of you not on, then what am I saying? Because I think we are a very, very collegiate institution, and there are collaborators right across this university. Dr. Damien Milton and Dr. Nick Chown are two researchers within our research centre, and they have not had permanent contracts, so that was a criteria which I used to put them on that image. But my permanent colleagues, we all collaborate with each other. That's what we do here. But these are organisations with whom we collaborate. So we've got Employment Autism, Hilary. There's Hilary, if anybody wants to talk about employment. We've got Autism Voice. Is there anybody here from Autism Voice? Autism Voice is an organisation of families based in Lambeth. It's a charity, and it looks at the experience of families affected by autism from Black, Asian, minority, ethnic backgrounds based in Lambeth. There's an awful lot of really good work, and we work closely with them. We held an interesting symposium with them recently. The Westminster Autism Commission, and there's a picture of Barry Shearman MP, who was the real catalyst for that. The Westminster Autism Commission I'll talk about in detail later, but we work really closely with them. And Autistic Doctors International, who knew there was a group called Autistic Doctors International made up of exactly that, 500 plus autistic doctors working on research. And there's an image there of somebody called Dr. Mary Doherty, who is a consultant anaesthetist, and she's also an MRes student at London South Bank University and on the steering group of our projects, which are health orientated, and her work is around psychiatry and mental health. It's fascinating work. So we collaborate with all sorts of people, we get funding from where we can, etc., and I've just picked out a few here. But this is the biggie, Damien, you're looking at it. There's references all the way through. This says Milton et al. There, and at the end there's a list of references. The PARC, the Participatory Autism Research Collective. And my daughter asked me what I was most proud of in terms of my career, and I said straight away it's the PARC, which really I shouldn't take credit for because it's actually Damien's baby. And because it's a collective, I can't say Damien is the leader of the PARC because we don't have a leader, but it's a collection of autistic researchers, not necessarily researching autism, not all autistic researchers research autism, but people who have basically often PhDs and no jobs because they want to break into the research community within academia and face massive challenges, and it's around the way the organisations are structured, and there's so many barriers to employment. So PARC is all over the place now. It's international. Events pop up all over the place, and anybody can join in. And a massive thank you to Neil, who's at the top of the stairs there, because recently we held a PARC event and over 600 people signed up. And if we didn't have Neil working his miracles, we wouldn't be able to have these sort of events. But the PARC is incredibly important. So, our principles, our research principles, we would like to be able to say we are emancipatory researchers. We aspire to be emancipatory researchers because emancipatory research is about ownership of the research agenda and the research resources by the stakeholder group, and the research being actually of practical benefit to the people who are being effectively researched, but in emancipatory terms are researching their own interests, aspirations, and so on. We do employ autistic researchers, but we have never employed somebody in a principal investigator position yet. We're aspiring to that. So we're sort of on the road to emancipatory. And we like a bit of an acronym. So this one down the side is SURE. We're thinking, what do we want our research to be like? SURE, stakeholder informed, involved, controlled, useful, respectful, and ethical. And this useful thing is a fundamental aspect of emancipatory research. But in terms of being respectful, researching autism, that should be carried out by autistic people, and it should conform to an agenda that is of practical use to autistic people who generally aren't really interested in genetics. They're mostly interested in what makes society better. There's a little graphic here about collaboration as well, which is critical. And I've written here the thorny issue of allyship, because I would not presume to say that I am an ally, because I can't self-identify as an ally. I'm only an ally if people say that I am an ally. So I don't know whether I am or not, but I would like to be. I aspire to allyship. So our research is interdisciplinary and collaborative. Social justice is absolutely the umbrella term under which we all operate, which is good, as we're in the Centre for Social Justice and Global Responsibility. And social model thinking really informs all the research that we've undertaken. And there's a little graphic here, which anybody in critical disability studies knows all about. And it's a picture of a person in a wheelchair at the bottom of a flight of stairs, and it says, "Weigh in, everyone welcome." And that person's impairment might be that they have a spinal injury, but their disability is absolutely that flight of stairs and the context in which that was a great idea to put a meeting in an inaccessible venue, thus creating that disability. So underneath that way of working, the themes that we've really focused on are education, employment, aspects of health and social care, looking at older age, looking at mentoring, and also looking at inclusive research practices. And all sorts of common threads emerge, but through all this, we've become acutely aware of common misconceptions around autism, which I just want to sort of take apart a little bit now. So, autism is rare in females. Autism is more diagnosed in males, but autism occurs across all genders. Male, female, non-binary, all genders. it's just less likely to be diagnosed in females. And the autistic role models that we know about are rarely other than cis male. And there's an image there of a person with tattoos. That's Jack Monroe, the food campaigner, and they identify as autistic and non-binary. Right, stimming inhibits learning. So remember, these are myths and misconceptions. So I'd invite you to do one of two things. Either think about a rocking chair and think about whether you'd enjoy being in a rocking chair, or just do that. And that might be stimming. So an autistic, often you see it in autistic children, and the reason that happens is because the sensory environment can be extremely challenging. And if you're doing something really close to your face like that, it's sort of distracting you, taking your mind off you and calming you down. It is therefore a functional behaviour, and being calm is conducive to learning. And I examined a PhD actually on why do autistic people stim, and the other examiner and we insisted on a modification where the candidate asked some autistic people and put in an extra chapter, and that was really important. So people who don't use words have nothing to say. That's a myth. And I draw your attention to Sally Brett's doctorate that she did here, and that was about children who had to talk about their aspirations while having a review for their education and healthcare plans, but didn't use words. So they were helped to do that by using drawings. And there's a sort of bluish image of somebody who's called Mel Baggs. And the reference is there on YouTube, and I just want you to look at it. We haven't got time now, it's only 8 minutes, but we haven't got 8 minutes. And Mel looks like somebody who is very, very profoundly disabled with a significant learning disability. And she's basically stimming and interacting with the sensory environment. And then through the aid of technology, she explains in a completely lucid way exactly what she is doing in a most articulate and intelligent way. And she was enabled to do that by technology. Mel is no longer with us because she died during the pandemic. And the pandemic had a very disproportionate effect on autistic people. Obsessions are a problem. If you just reframe that and say, people's in-depth interests are really useful, that is a much better way of looking at it. It's really insulting to describe people's interests as obsessions. And the problem is people calling in-depth interests obsessions. Autistic people are loners. Some autistic people like spending time by themselves. Everybody, you know, have different preferences in terms of the way they interact with people. Some autistic people don't like social interaction, which is really noisy and crowded and horrible, which is why in the reception afterwards we've got a quiet room as well, or you can just come back in here if you want to interact in a quieter way. But autistic people operate in all sorts of environments, including families. You have autistic parents, friendship groups, and everything else. It's just a myth that autistic people are loners. And autism equates to unhappiness. Families with autistic children are unhappy families. Why do you think that? I mean, I'm not suggesting anybody in this room thinks that, but what parents of autistic children say and what autistic adults say is we are incredibly frustrated by the treacle of bureaucracy which surrounds our situation, and we can't get the services we need and we can't get access to what we need without going through completely ridiculous contortions, and that makes us really frustrated. But unhappiness is also socially constructed by massive loads of frustration. We're all a little bit autistic. Please never say that, because that really undermines the challenges that autistic people actually face. And eye contact is necessary for effective communication. Dr. Nick Chown and I did some research around the doctoral viva and challenges around the doctoral viva, one of them being having to look at these complete strangers while you're already completely stressed out trying to defend your doctoral thesis. And it's not every culture in which eye contact is seen as a really important aspect of communication. So I think if you just think, well, it doesn't matter if they look at me or not, then you probably get on a lot better. Because that's another social construction, isn't it? We all have to stare at each other while we're talking. And it can create massive sensory overload. And autism equals genius. Genius pressure is ridiculous. And I'll talk about that on the next slide. And in the corner, there's a picture of somebody who's part of the commission called Helen Ellis, and she's holding up a book, Autism and Masking. And masking, passing, camouflaging is effectively not being able to bring your authentic self to work because you might look a little bit autistic. Well, what's wrong with being a little bit autistic? Not a little bit autistic. What's wrong with appearing autistic? So what? And it's a real massive pressure to have to not stim, join in the water cooler moments when you don't really want to do it and all that sort of thing. So we just have to be careful to avoid that because it's pressure that we are creating for autistic people. Okay, and so this is the genius myth. It's true, some autistic people have exceptional ability and expertise, often around an in-depth interest, and this is about application and practice. Some have got learning disabilities as well as autism. Autism is not a learning disability, but some people with learning disabilities have autism as well. Autism is also not a mental health issue. It's a form of neurodivergence, but you can acquire a mental health issue alongside autism, particularly in an environment which is incredibly frustrating and challenging. And everything in between, you know, anybody can be autistic, any gender. You don't have to be a genius, you don't have to have a learning disability, you don't have to have a mental health issue. There are all sorts of autistic people, and everybody knows someone who is autistic, but they might not realise that they do. And there's some images here. There's some black and white images of Wittgenstein and Newton, because what happens is people are posthumously diagnosed as autistic geniuses for some reason, and the same thing applies with Einstein on the previous slide. And other images of people who are either out and proud as autistic or have actually been outed. In the case of Susan Boyle, when she was on Britain's Got Talent, was outed as autistic in a way that she actually didn't choose. And this is about agency and choice, which I think is a really important consideration. Now, language is a site of struggle. And Nick Hodge and I, with others, have written a paper in a book that Damien has edited with Sarah Ryan about negative teacher talk. And just looking through all these labels and words, genius, talked about that already, disclose and inform. Look at those two words. Disclose sounds like you might have a little bit of a secret that's a little bit salacious. Inform is just tell somebody. And students talk about having to disclose. And we've done a lot of work on that with the National Association of Disability Practitioners to get UCAS to knock the D word off their forms because it's basically problematic. Special needs combines two of the most patronising euphemisms in the English language, which is problematic because it's all over all the official documentation. And person with autism versus autistic person. And the best way to describe that is, just think about this. Would you ever say person with gay? You wouldn't, would you? And it's part of somebody's identity. It's integral to them. It's just not an add-on or a thing that, you know, you can put on and take off as being gay in exactly the same way. So just think about it like that. And we talk about autistic people. And the D word, autism spectrum disorder. Who said it was disordered? It's really another thing which is an unnecessary label which is problematic. Challenging behaviour needs to be replaced with indicator of distress. And low ability. Any teacher in the room that's ever been in a school where there's a little table of children with low ability, even if you call them LA, that is just not okay because of the stigma surrounding that sort of negative teacher behaviour. And we do teacher education here. I'm looking at my colleagues, and this is just, I'm just regurgitating the stuff we say on our courses the whole time. And then I've got some images here. Rain Man, challenging behaviour. Rain Man, genius. These negative stereotypes in the media are incredibly unhelpful. And then I've got a horrible one of just a young man, but I've seen him pictured in all sorts of other ways, including with 2 guns with a big label, the Virginia Tech shooter. And this is very, very current at the moment. And every time there's a school shooting, rather than blaming it on the gun lobby, we get this thing about, oh, is this person autistic? Have they got mental health issues? Are they autistic? And the autistic community collectively holds its breath because this might happen again. This time in Texas, it's the trans community that is getting it in the neck. And it's really problematic. So all this language stuff is really important. And there's an image on this slide of Foucault, who's talked extensively about power, language, and those dynamics. So all our research, everything we write up, is about autistic strengths. And we come from a strengths-based model. We don't problematize autism. We problematize everything surrounding autism, which makes the lives of autistic people difficult. And these are some of the strengths. Monotropism, which is about focus, particularly around in-depth interest, doing one thing at a time and doing it really well, and not necessarily wanting to be deflected from that thing. Application, productivity, reliability, integrity, all those things which are great for students, great in employment, absolute strengths. And community building, mutual support and empathy, and they've put a capital letter by empathy because it's such a contested site really around autism. The organisations such as PARC and Autistic Doctors International are all about autistic people working together and building community and putting energy and enthusiasm into that, and really sort of knocking on the head the idea that autistic people are loners and operate in isolation. And in terms of empathy, those who identify as non-autistic also need to flex their own empathy muscles. And Damien will talk about the double empathy problem, which he's written about extensively, and there's just been a conference about this. And it's this thing about why do autistic people get labelled with those who lack empathy, where non-autistic people are not really trying to empathise with autistic people. And we talk a lot about bell hooks in education, and this is a quote from bell hooks which I think is really lovely. Beloved community is formed not by the eradication of difference, but by its affirmation, by each of us claiming the identities and cultural legacies that shape who we are and how we live in the world. So, autistic challenges. If I was being very medical model, I'd say executive function, central coherence, theory of mind, sensory, etc. But we look at it the other way, and these are the sort of challenges autistic people face. Access to diagnosis, long waiting lists, post-diagnostic services being practically non-existent, and services which are behind a wall without a diagnostic label. And going back to our autistic communities of practice, you don't need a diagnostic label to be part of the PARC, for example, because PARC people know adult diagnosis is hard to obtain, but there are all sorts of things you need a diagnosis for. This thing about a treacle of bureaucracy and navigating the chaos around getting the services you need. Access to healthcare is problematic. Premature mortality of autistic people is a thing. And lack of joined-up support across the lifespan is really an important concern, because people can drop between services at different stages, and also drop between learning disability and mental health services, because autism is neither, but lack of bespoke services is another problem. And then educational exclusion, unemployment, underemployment and poverty, they're all knock-on effects. High rates of exclusion of autistic people from school, difficulty getting into employment for all the barriers to employment, such as an interview, which is this social situation where you may not shine, rather than having a go at doing the actual job and tasks associating with the job so you can demonstrate that you can do it. Underemployment, in the pharmacist near us, there's a woman there who's got a degree in pharmacy, whatever it's called. She's a shop assistant, though, in a chemist, and that's as close as she's got. And obviously, underemployment equals poverty. Trauma, bullying, hate crime, all those sort of things. Autistic people have multiple experiences of being bullied in school, for example. And a big challenge for autistic people is the cure seekers. There's a charity here, Cure Autism Now. How deeply insulting is that? And then stereotyping, threats to autonomy and threats to agency. And there's a little graphic here, Jean-Paul Sartre, hell is other people. So, reasonable adjustments are often cheap and easy, and they benefit everyone. Good autism practice is just good practice. It's just universal design. It's not complicated. So we talk about embedding universal design to reduce the requirement for reasonable adjustments. And that's about planning for diversity rather than being surprised that there is no such person as mythical norm. And I think Damien and I wrote a chapter where we made up mythical norm. I can't remember, but it's quoted from something that I've been involved in writing. And it's about everything. Universal design is about everything, every sort of context. Universal design for learning is about education. Autistic people usually know what they need, and it's usually really simple. Like, please can you explain to me how I navigate the system to make sure I get paid for this work? Simple. And nobody thrives in chaos. So this thing about reasonable adjustments, it needs to be happening at the planning stage. And Kimberly Crenshaw, pictured here, talks about intersectionality. So we have to be careful not to think of autism, the impairment label, as the whole identity, because you could be autistic and old, you could be autistic and poor, you could be autistic and gay. You could be autistic and be digitally excluded because you haven't got a computer, for example. So when the pandemic hit, we had to think very intersectionally around supporting our students, and we did the best job we could. And we also did research which was very particularly around the effect of the pandemic on our autistic students in collaboration with National Association of Disability Practitioners, and came up with some guidance anticipating that they were going to have to suddenly manage to thrive in chaos and maybe needed a bit of support. And also with Barbara Peacock as one of our visiting fellows, we looked at looking after the educational and wellbeing needs of your autistic child at home during the pandemic. So this universal design principle underpins this idea of making society more conducive to the well-being and thriving of autistic people, and brackets, everybody else. So, Cambridge colleagues will get this graphic. We had a project in Cambridge working with Cambridge students looking at what makes university a bit better for autistic students. And we came up with this sort of easy, handy thing, which we use a lot in staff development. We do mentor training for people working with autistic students in higher education through the National Association of Disability Practitioners, based on the Signet Mentoring Project, which was one of our researchers, which Damien was the researcher on. And this underpins some of our training. So everything, just absolutely everything, should be reliable, empathic, anticipatory and logical. So forget autism for a minute and think about life. Think about your workplace, your partner. If everything was like that, it would be great. So, people and systems need to reliably do what they say they are going to do. Planning needs to be built on empathically looking at situations from various perspectives and enacting the anticipatory duties of the 2010 Equality Act by planning for diverse participation. And logical, workable systems communicated clearly make life easier and more productive for everyone. So there are real principles which are about universal design for learning. So this is about our collaborations to try and address some of these challenges. Services are often ineffective. There's a SEND review underway at the moment, Special Education Needs and Disability Review, entitled Right Support, Right Place, Right Time. And with the Westminster Autism Commission, I chaired a meeting last week looking at our response to the SEND review because it's in its consultation phase. Also, Autism Voice are looking at that because their research has found a lot of cultural insensitivity to autistic families from BAME communities. So we're in this consultation, and the Children and Families Act was all about joined up thinking between health, education and social care. Parents are finding it doesn't work really effectively, and the whole thing is under review. Universities don't always have support in place for autistic students at the start of their course. NADP is all over this agenda, and you don't have to have disabled students allowance to be supported in university, and that's really important. And employment services such as access to work don't easily translate into useful support on the ground, and this is one for employment autism. So all this collaborative research work coalesces around the idea of doing something which is actually useful. This is something about the work of the Autism Commission, and South Bank is very involved in this and is going to be more involved in it in the future, because the MP Barry Shearman looks very youthful but is actually 82, which is astonishing. I thought he was 72, and is not standing in the next election, and we're looking at playing a very substantial role in keeping the commission going after Barry has retired. But these are some of our projects which relate to the work of the Commission. So these difficulties, diagnostic and post-diagnostic support, Commission did a report on that. Falling between learning disability and mental health services, this report, A Spectrum of Obstacles, is about access to health services. We currently have 2 projects going with NHS England, NHS Improvement, and the John and Lorna Wing Foundation looking at health. So GP health checks are not uniformly available and don't cover dentistry or mental health, and medical practitioners are not well informed about autism. So with Autistic Doctors International, actually, we're looking at this, and doctors like to have training from doctors. And this is, some of these findings are so breathtakingly obvious, it makes you wonder why we do the research in the first place. But this is our useful research around that, and we're in the process of developing training for doctors. And autistic people who do not use words and older family carers are often not heard. And we have Penn in the corner there, who is our illustrator, who is also going to produce some information for us for older family carers who very often are completely worried about what will happen to their son or daughter when they die. They are looking after an adult with autism and intellectual impairment who may not have a formal diagnosis, and then they may have a stroke, and then their son or daughter ends up in residential care with absolutely no preparation. But these older carers don't necessarily access information on the internet. So 2 of our research findings are: 1, let's make a poster and put it in a GP surgery, which is what Penn is up to. 2, let's just pop a little letter in the post. And it's sort of not rocket science. And this one here, A Spectrum of Harmful Interventions for Autism, is another Commission report, which is to me the most fundamentally important report. Because when parents are told their child is autistic, it is often accompanied by a load of negative deficit model tragedy thinking, and sometimes it encourages parents to seek a way to fix it. It doesn't need fixing, but that can lead to some harmful treatments. And if you read that, you'll realise where Donald Trump got the idea of injecting people with bleach. It's really problematic. It's only a short report. There's loads of them in my office. If you want some afterwards, I can go and get some, actually. So there are some of our important collaborations. Key message is that agency is crucial to happiness, well-being, fulfilment. And autistic people sometimes find that their agency is compromised. If you acquire an autism diagnosis in adulthood, you have made a choice. Some children have been diagnosed with autism, maybe at 7 years old. By the time they're 15, they don't like that label anymore, and it has been imposed upon them by a system to enable them to access educational services. That has compromised the agency of those young children, and that is problematic. Another thing that I find really, really difficult is when you see television programmes like Super Nanny or something like that, the most badly behaved child in the world, and some very distressed child is on the television or on the internet, and that's there forever. That compromises agency. So access to education, employment, healthcare and community, I've already talked about how they can be problematic. Unregulated mentoring schemes without adequate supervision can be awful. Bossy mentors. A mentor can be a role, but you can also sort of identify as a mentor. You know, you hear people saying, oh, I'm a mentor. I think, really, who's paying you to be a mentor? Because sometimes that role is interpreted as, I'm going to tell you what to do. And also as parents, we have to be a bit careful, don't we? And I know I fall into this trap, but I try hard not to. But it's this thing about our mentoring project here was about helping autistic people to identify their own goals and take steps towards realising them. And also, we were very keen that mentors should be properly trained and properly supervised. And many mentoring projects do not have adequate supervision. And then there's this whole thing about judgment, surveillance, around sexuality, around parenting, around interests, and simply around ways of being. So if a person identifies as trans and they're also autistic, and the intersection between being trans and autistic is a whole lecture all by itself, and they go to the doctor and the doctor says, oh, better sort your autism out first, that is really compromising and problematic. Or if an autistic parent doesn't want to go to the doctor because they fear that their parenting will be judged, that is problematic. And there's a picture in the bottom of Jeremy Bentham and his panopticon. This is something that Foucault talks about as well. And this is about the notion of surveillance, which is all over critical disability studies and really important. The tyranny of low expectations really compromises agency, thinking people can't do that job, can't go to university, whatever it is. And with NADP, we've been very careful to make sure that transition teachers and parents know about the support that's available in university, so they don't make assumptions that autistic people won't be able to cope, because they very often do very well and get very good degrees. But you get children not taken on university visits with their schools because the teacher that they won't be able to manage, and that is compromising of agency. And the whole power dynamic thing, I'm acutely aware of. In my role, I'm acutely aware. For example, at the moment, my main researcher on two of my projects, Dr. Nick Chown, he's a much better researcher than me. His contract came to an end yesterday, and he's just started another little contract. So he's going from insecure employment to insecure employment all the time. And there's that power dynamic there where I have much more agency and capital than he has, and that's systemic and problematic. And we're really very interested in personal construct theory, i.e. the way that person sees the world is absolutely valid, and you need to see the world through the eyes of that person by flexing your empathy muscles. So, way forward. We're very involved in the SEND review. We are involving ourselves in the national strategy and actively seeking funding to involve ourselves deeply in the national strategy. We're really interested in joined up autism research because various funders fund similar projects and don't necessarily talk to each other. And Dr. Nick Chown, again, took it upon himself to look at all the other current research, not published, ongoing, around our Access to Healthcare project, and actively got people together to work collaboratively. And we made that recommendation in our report, like, why don't all these little projects talk to each other? Would be a good idea. Real participation of autistic people in research, which is informed by the priorities of autistic people. And as early as 2014, Liz Pellicano and colleagues did some research around that, and autistic people don't care particularly about genetics, cures, particularly, that sort of thing. They care about making society more inclusive. Autistic researchers would benefit from stable employment contracts, obviously, and the way contracting researchers works in higher education is problematic for all sorts of people, because we have to get the funding in, which is very often invisible work, and then we've got the wherewithal to pay somebody for as long as we've got that funding, then we're looking for another pot of funding, and it's not a great way to work. But it's much better than milking people's expertise for free, and that happens to so many autistic academics. and support for organisations such as Park. Park is absolutely brilliant, and it runs on fresh air and energy. You know, look at the website and you'll see all the activities that are going on. And this university and other universities are very good for supporting organisations such as Park in kind by providing venues like this for nothing, because we have a lot of students who are studying autism who also come along to the Park event, so it's a win-win situation. And you know, they get all their university catering and everything else. But Park really needs an administrator, and it's really hard to find funding for that. A couple of events coming up. The first Professor Michael Lewis annual lecture, Stephen Unwin, our writer-in-residence, is going to explore the case for reform in the culture and politics of learning disability. There's an Eventbrite link there. Please come to that. On the 25th of July, we're having a conference about autism and employment in collaboration with Autism Employment. Details to follow. A couple of dissemination events around our research projects. And Park has an annual conference and a seminar series, and that's just an ongoing thing which we advertise on the Park website and on the CADS website. I'm just looking at the watch. I'm coming to my final slide, so we're not doing too badly. So this is my concluding question to you. I'm talking about autism, well-being and fulfilment. Just thinking about well-being and fulfilment now. It doesn't matter about autism for this discussion. And this is a graphic we use all the time with our students. I keep looking at my education colleagues down here. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's really, really old, but it's actually really important. So, in order to get to the top of that pyramid, all the blocks underneath it need to be in place. Self-actualization means being fulfilled, happy, gainfully employed, in loving relationships, all that sort of thing. Self-actualization is about being the person you want to be. But at the bottom of the pyramid, if your physiological needs are not met, you're hungry, you're thirsty, you're in insecure housing, you're not breathing clean air, etc. If your safety needs are not met because you're in insecure housing, you've been bullied, you're subject to hate crime. If love and belonging is something that is not really there in an unconditional way in your life, because everybody wants you to change. They don't really want you to be autistic. They want you to be some other being. That really has a knock-on effect on your self-esteem. And in turn, self-actualization is not going to happen under those conditions. So basically, people need to be warm, fed, safe, included, supported in order to be self-actualized. And there's a reference at the back by somebody called Jim Sinclair, and he wrote a piece called Don't Mourn for Us, which we always go through with our students. And basically what Jim says is, you know, you thought you were going to have this non-autistic child, but you had me. So actually, that person that you were mourning never existed in the first place. So just get on with loving me, thank you, exactly as I am. And I think that's a really important message for everybody. It's not even an autism thing. And I just hate to keep from the reception, and it's 3 minutes past 7, not 7 minutes past 3. So, very happy to have a chat with anybody during the reception, and there is a quiet room if you don't want to be mixing and mingling with everybody, or you can come back in here. So that's me. Various references. Thank you very much.
Right, good evening. Sorry, before you all dash off, and there is food and drinks available. Drinks this afternoon, or this evening, they weren't available this afternoon. Not that I'm complaining. I'd just like to say a few words. My name is Professor Craig Barker, and I'm the Dean of the School of Law and Social Sciences, in which Nicki is a professor. And I've got to say that one of the things that I was surprised at was that, you know, it's such a long time since we got the news that you were a professor. And I know there's been the pandemic and stuff, but I'm just really delighted to be able to be here and to congratulate Nicki on a fantastic lecture and really just hear a lot more about what she's got to say. I've been working with her for 7.5 years, and I can say one or two things about her. The first is that I get stressed. We all get stressed, but when Nicki comes in the room, you do feel a little bit uplifted. She is happy, she's engaging, there's not a lot, and maybe your family are going to say something different, but I really, no, well, I don't know, people, well, 40 years was it you've been working, but, what I mean is that when you're closer to people, things are slightly different, but certainly from a professional perspective, it's fantastic to work with you. There's a lot of positivity. I think that we heard reference to the centre earlier, Centre for Social Justice and Global Responsibility, that Shaminder and Nicki are co-leading, and we've been through a few ups and downs with that, but certainly we're moving in the right direction. Thank you for that, as Dean. I've got to say that and this isn't about me, of course, because I've never leaving academia. And one of the things I've been thinking about is, well, what is it that we do as academics, and particularly as social science academics? I'm a lawyer, don't hold it against me, and I'm not sure that, I'm struggling to understand what difference I have made, what impact I have had. Sure, I've written stuff and people have read it and whatever, but what difference I've made. And then I was thinking about Nicki and listening to Nicki. And this amazing thing where not only has your work impacted on policy and it's facilitating changes in policy, but your work has also impacted on groups and on individuals. And if you're going to talk about social justice for one person is as strong as social justice for thousands of people. And it's making that difference to individuals that I think really sets you apart, makes me very proud to work with you. I get very emotional. What is that? What is that? I love that nothing about us without us, and I really do love some of these things are sure and real. But it's been a real pleasure. I think that was really informative. And the biggest thing I take away from it, and I know this is very minor, but I'm a diabetic. And everybody, all the doctors and nurses say, you're not a diabetic, you're a person with diabetes. Now I can go and say, no, I'm a diabetic, because we're allowed to say what we are, we're allowed to own it. So thank you for that as well. So Nicki, it's been a real pleasure, and can I just ask everybody to thank Nicki for her talk today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have here this is a picture of the poster, and we'd like you to take that.
Thank you very much.
And find somewhere nice to hang it up. I don't know if there's.
Thank you very much.
Find somewhere nice to hang it up.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's.